Okay, so again, thanks everybody for coming. People still showing up all the time. Hopefully we can break again the 100 participant mark as we've done for the last couple of weeks. This is the third seminar now in our online series, International Perspectives for Corpus Technology for Language Learning. As I mentioned before, we are honored and privileged to have Professor Michael Haugh speaking today on spoken language corpora and second language pragmatics. So quite a big departure from the first two talks, but something that we're very much interested in here to see ways that we can use corpora within the field of pragmatics. It's going to be a really enlightening talk for all of us, I'm sure. So about our speaker for today, Professor Michael Haugh is Professor of Linguistics and Applied Linguistics at our school, at the School of Languages and Cultures at the University of Queensland in Australia. His research interests lie primarily in the field of pragmatics, focusing on the role of language in social interaction. He's co-led the establishment of the LADAL Lab, that's the Language Technology and Data Analytics Lab, with Dr. Soon. Not sure what happened there. He's former co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Pragmatics and currently co-editor-in-chief of the Cambridge Elements in Pragmatics. He's incredibly well published with more than 120 books and articles in the field of pragmatics. So thank you very much, Michael Haugh, and we're ready to hear your talk tonight.
Thanks a lot, Peter. So I'll just share my,
I'll stop sharing my screen now, and then you're ready to share your screen.
Sure. Okay. Give me a second. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming along. I have to admit, I reread my abstract and perhaps I overpromised a little bit. I'm probably not going to get through all of pragmatics, corpus pragmatics, second language pragmatics, all in the space of 45 minutes. So my aim tonight really is to talk about how corpus pragmatics and pragmatics intersect, and some of the implications that I draw out of that for second language pragmatics and what we might be doing in the classroom. But my focus will be really more on the what and the why, and perhaps less on the how, partly because I think there's not enough time, and partly because I think there's other people who know a lot more about the how than I do. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. This is something that we do in Australia as part of recognising the particular special place that First Nations or Indigenous Australians play in this country. And I'm broadcasting from the lands of the Yugara and Turrbal peoples. And so I pay my respects to their ancestors' descendants and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. So today, as I said, I'll try to pare it back a little bit so that we can get through and perhaps have some time for some questions. So I'll start outlining what it is I mean by pragmatics, because pragmatics is actually a really large field. And then I'll start talking about second language pragmatics and connect up the approach to pragmatics that I'm working on and how that intersects with second language pragmatics. Then I want to bring it in corpus pragmatics, how we can start pushing the sort of boundaries of what we do in corpus pragmatics, and then think about some implications of that. Okay, so what is pragmatics? So essentially it's the study of how people produce and interpret language in different contexts. So it's all about language use. And some of the sorts of things that we, are really typical topics of interest or study in pragmatics are things like reference. So we have to infer who it is we're talking about. Presupposition, we go in with all sorts of background assumptions. Implicages, we imply things. A lot of what we mean is not said. Speech acts, we do things with language, and also interpersonal attitudes, things like politeness, all sorts of different moral and affective evaluations. And underlying all of that is are these processes of pragmatic inference and meaning. One of the things I find in pragmatics is very often in linguistics programs, they tend to teach one end of pragmatics, which is what we might call linguistic pragmatics. But there's a really large and thriving part of pragmatics, which is really focused more on how people use language. So there's a focus on the person, the people. Linguistic pragmatics is really focusing on the utterances that people use. So linguistic pragmatics is really seeing pragmatics as a component of linguistics. So it's something that goes alongside phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics. And the focus of people working broadly in linguistic pragmatics is on cognitive, linguistic, and conventional dimensions of language use. So you can get a really good overview of what I mean by linguistic pragmatics by looking at, for instance, the Cambridge Handbook of Pragmatics, which really is largely focused on different dimensions of linguistic pragmatics. Sociopragmatics is kind of perhaps the other half of pragmatics. I don't know if it's a half or 2/3 or 1/3. I haven't done a head count. But really what's interesting about sociopragmatics is this is pragmatics at the intersection of linguistics, psychology, sociology, and anthropology. So it's not seeing pragmatics as a kind of part of linguistic, but actually lying at the intersection of a number of fields, because of course psychology is about to do with people's minds, sociology, society, and anthropology, of course, culture. And the focus in sociopragmatics is on social, interactional, and normative dimensions of language use. And you can get a fairly good account of what we mean by sociopragmatics in the recently published Cambridge Handbook of Sociopragmatics. My motivation for co-editing that with my colleagues Daniel Kardar and Marina Tokarafi was simply because we all felt that the previous handbook, although really in depth and a great account of parts of pragmatics, didn't really do justice to the socio-pragmatic end of things. Okay. However, even though I'm splitting, talking about linguistic pragmatics and social pragmatics, in the end, we just want to do pragmatics. And so the approach that I work on together with Jonathan Culpepper is what we call integrative pragmatics, or integrated pragmatics, if you prefer, which is the systematic study of interactional meanings of particular form function relationships in and across particular situated context. And the important thing about integrative pragmatics is we're really wanting to draw from both user and observer perspectives on language use. So sometimes users is seen as a first order perspective and observer second order. But some of the things we're really interested in integrative pragmatics is the pragmatic forms, functions, and contexts, which come together through recurrent practices to make available interactional meanings. Another area of great interest is what we call meta-pragmatics. This is people's awareness of the ways in which they're using language and how they talk about how they use language. And of course, variation is a really important part of pragmatics as well, and the systematic ways in which language use varies across different speakers, groups of speakers, and contexts, and so on. Okay, so what do I mean by user and observer perspectives? And what do I mean by these kind of recurrent ways in which we make available meanings? So I'll just give you this example here. A number of them tonight that I'm playing through are what we call first conversations. So there's recordings of interaction between people who haven't met before. And there's also, what I would say about these, some of them are actually available on publicly available corpora. Some of them are not yet publicly available, as in open to research, other researchers, but certainly that's the direction in which we're going, to make these available so people can use the data as well. So this particular interaction, this is between Nick and Tammy. Nick is an Australian guy. Tammy is from somewhere in the Midwest of the US. And Nick's been talking about how he has been making an iPhone app. Just so you know, this recording was done around 2012. So that sounded, making an app sounded really kind of pretty cool at that time. Perhaps it's not quite as exciting these days. Okay, so I'll play the clip. Unfortunately, the sound's a little bit soft, but I'll just play it anyway to give you a sense of it.
What are you looking to get into? What else are you interested in?
At the moment, I've got. I'm making an iPhone app.
Really?
Well, when I say that, I mean I've hired Indians to make it for me. I don't know if they're going to like get.
Okay, so the particular bit that I'm interested in looking at is here. So when he says, I'm making an iPhone app, we get this really, ha 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 ha. And this is a kind of appreciative surprise. So it implies a generally positive assessment of what it is Nick is doing. So, oh, wow. So a kind of implication of complimenting what it is he's doing there. And he responds with this here. He says, well, when I say that, I mean I've hired Indians to make it for me. So here, and she responds with laughter. So this particular response here is designed to be heard as some kind of jocular self-deprecation. It's not me who did it. It's actually other people who did it. And in this way, he's deflecting the appreciative surprise. So what's going on here? What Nick is doing is he's dealing with two kinds of preference that we have in English. So one preference is when someone gives a compliment, there's a preference for avoiding self-praise. So when someone compliments you and goes, you know, that was a great talk, Michael, and I go, yeah, it was actually. You might find that a little odd if I said that. You might expect, you know, thank you, or no, your talk's much better. So there's various ways in which we respond. People don't generally in English respond with emphatic agreement. However, there's another issue. There's another type of preference at play here, which is when people make assessments, there's a preference for agreement. So what we've got here is two cross-cutting preferences which are not consonant. So the way in which Nick deals with the preference for avoiding self-praise, which would be rejecting this kind of appreciation, and the preference for agreeing with assessments is by deflecting. And so this is what he does. What's interesting here is Tammy seems to show, you know, appreciation for the joke. However, afterwards, something else goes on. And of course, if you're paying attention, you might notice his reference to Indians as a group and how that could be interpreted. So I'll just play the clip. This clip here is with Lara, actually, she's a PhD student in our school. She's interviewing Tammy about, you know, what happened in that interaction.
And one thing that kind of caught me a bit was he said, oh, I paid some Indians to do it.
Yeah.
And like, I don't know, from the States, like we're very multicultural.
Yeah.
Like I know he was just joking, but that was something I was like, oh, okay. So maybe a bit offensive, but.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, and then one thing that.
Okay. So what's interesting here is the bit I want to focus on is eventually she gets to this. So she makes an assessment of that kind of joking, self-deprecatory remark that Nick made. She says it was offensive. Now, there's a few things we'd notice about this assessment of his remark as offensive. First of all, its position. It's very delayed. There's a lot of preamble before she gets to the assessment itself. So she also gives an account. I'm from the States, like we're very multicultural, yeah. And then we finally get to the assessment. The other thing to notice is its composition. It's really highly calibrated, and it's sort of situated in this particular interview context, which is, I think, an interesting sort of methodological point when we're doing this kind of sequential analysis, discourse analysis and pragmatics, asking people what they think just creates a new text for us to analyze as well. So it's not straightforward getting into the minds of people, as we can see here. So I really want to start digging into the composition of Tammy's assessment here. Okay, so I know he was just joking, but that was something I was like, oh, okay. So my response, maybe a bit offensive, but okay, that's a very long-winded way of saying it. So if we start trying to break it down, just this particular composition, we see there's hesitation, we can see there's some kind of epistemic incongruence. She's attributing a non-serious stance to him. There's this kind of quotative, like a punched up intonation contour, change of state, utterance final, so, then that's also delivered sotto voce. Then we have a laugh response, modal adverb, hedge, offensive, and then finally utterance final but. There's a lot of components here that have been assembled in order to deliver this particular assessment. So overall, what we could say is this assessment is being delivered as if it's something very delicate. It's being delivered with what we call a dispreferred format. So if we start digging into it even further, so joking, this is actually a meta-pragmatic term. So talking about what you're talking about, or labeling it in some way. So she's labeling what Nick was doing as joking is a kind of meta-pragmatic act. So here she's attributing a non-serious stance to him. So, she's inoculating against defense and showing that, she understood he wasn't trying to cause offense. What's interesting about this is we can see from corpus studies, so both Skalaki, Berger and Bell, and also my recent study of these terms gives us some kind of insights into these terms. So this is where I'm starting to try to draw from Corpus Pragmatics. And so we can see that just joking is a term common to both American, Australian, English. But what's interesting here is the use of just. It's kind of a minimizing, but also construing it as a very ordinary type of thing. And so we can start to see that she's framing it in a particular way. The other thing about the joking bit of it is it's foregrounding the not serious nature of it, as opposed to kidding, which is foregrounding kind of play or so on. If we go on further, we can see I was like. This is a recurrent formula from corpus studies showing that this is used to report unspoken inner thoughts. So she's positioning what's coming next as something she thought, but didn't actually say at the time when Nick made the comment. Then we get this enacting surprised through this punched up prosody. And then we get to this kind of delicate bit. So we get this utterance final so, which projecting some kind of unstated upshot, and it's sotto voce. I know the little degree symbols, that means it's delivered softly, which is again indexing some kind of delicacy here. And here we have a laugh response from Lara, which is recurrently used to diffuse criticisms because this could be treated as a complaint or a forthcoming complaint by Tammy. Okay, then we finally get to the assessment. We get maybe a modal adverb, which is indicating an epistemic stance and adjusting the gradient so that it's less certain. We have a bit, which actually sets up a scalar implicature. So a bit implies not a lot, for instance, but that implicature, of course, is defeasible. It was a bit offensive. In fact, it was really offensive. So we can actually cancel those kind of scalar implicatures. And then finally, we get the assessment itself. So offensive is some kind of moral assessment. What's interesting, and this is from a corpus study that I did with Jonathan Culpepper, looking at the collocates of with offensive in the Australian and American component of the Oxford English corpus. What's interesting here is we can see racially collocates more strongly with offensive in the American component as opposed to the Australian one. And finally, we have this utterance final but, which leaves some kind of hanging implication. So we can see that Tammy's wanting to say more, but leaving it unsaid. So this is construing this as a highly delicate matter. So sort of linking together this kind of corpus study of offensive in American English and Australian English, the association, strong association with racially offensive in American English, less so, that actually backs up what Tammy says in terms of American society being multicultural. Of course, Australian society is multicultural. What's interesting is, at least at this time, or for Nick, he's not associating it so much with racially. Of course, things are changing rapidly as well. Okay, so what's going on here? So what I was trying to point to is these kind of form-function relationships and what speakers are doing in spoken interaction, which is assembling all sorts of form-function relationships in really highly calibrated ways to deliver meanings with particular tones and so on. And so one of the ways in which we can study it is drawing from the work of Garfinkel. And essentially his really important insight is the idea that the way in which we produce and manage our settings of organized everyday affairs are identical with the members' procedures for making those settings accountable. So what did Garfinkel mean by that? So elements of conduct, all the different components of Tammy's assessment and where it falls within the broader discourse, this is made intelligible, so recognizable, understandable, but also accountable, so reportable. The speaker's reportable and responsible for what they do as implementing meanings for both users and observers on the basis of the practices by which they're implemented. So what that means, that there's two important upshots from that. One is meanings are accomplished through assemblages of practices. And second, if we want to understand these practices, we need to start looking at large collections of data, which of course, that's what a corpus is. So what we're working with in integrated pragmatics is trying to draw together user perspectives. So that's very much interactional pragmatics, looking at things in terms of their sequential place, but also the observer perspective. So corpus pragmatics and corpus-based metapragmatics, where you're really working across an aggregated set of language use. So interactional pragmatics is looking at how individual speakers are using language in a particular moment. Of course, corpus pragmatics is looking at how language is used across an aggregated group of speakers. But what's interesting about it, interactional pragmatics is collections-based, and corpus pragmatics, of course, is corpus-based. So both of them actually draw on as large as possible, collections of data. Okay, so what are the, how do I connect this in with second language pragmatics? Okay, so L2 pragmatics, this is about how L2 speakers, so people for whom the language is not their mother home tongue, perhaps, difficult to define sometimes, but how these speakers produce and interpret their second language in different contexts, and how they come to know how to do just that. So how is it that L2 speakers come to learn how to produce and interpret that second language in different contexts? Of course, we're very familiar with looking at it in the classroom context, but people learn second languages in all sorts of different ways, through life and just interacting with people. So there's essentially three key components of second language pragmatics, looking at L2 production, second language production, comprehension and awareness, and interaction. So if we just sort of look really briefly at these different parts, to date, I think a lot of work in second language pragmatics on the production side has been really looking at the production of speech acts and politeness strategies. And very often it's drawing from theories of pragmatics, such as Brown and Levinson's politeness theory and so on, which are actually not used so frequently in other parts of pragmatics. So that's an interesting thing that's going on. Some of the key methods that you see happening are things like discourse completion, tests. That's where something's written down and the person responds what they would say. But of course, it's not, they don't say what they would say, they actually write it down. We know that that can be a bit of a problem because there's a difference between speaking and writing, of course. So more recently, there's been use of role plays as well to draw out the production of different kinds of speech acts and politeness strategies by second language speakers. There's also a focus on comprehension and awareness by second language speakers of language use. Some of the things that have received quite a bit of attention is the comprehension of implicatures or indirect speech. So are second language speakers picking up on things which are not said? So there's quite a bit of research focusing on the way in which in a second language speakers often focus more on what is said, they focus on conventional meanings and so on, but also awareness of politeness strategies as well. And if you're trying to get into comprehension awareness, some of the methods of choice include multi-choice tests, but also metapragmatic interviews to sort of probe what kinds of understandings people have. Finally, we have second language interaction. So if we want to track the development of pragmatic competence of second language speakers, just observing and recording and analyzing how they interact with others is probably the most ecologically valid way of doing it. So, of course, one of the challenges of studying participation by second language speakers in different activities and contexts is there's an awful lot of them. And if you're trying to test, we need to control for those. So some of the key methods that are used, again, are things like role plays, where you can control the type of activity and sort of variables that might affect the performance of the L2 speaker, but also elicited conversations. And perhaps more recently, spontaneous conversations are starting to be used more frequently in the field as well. Okay, so I showed a first conversation there between Nick and Tammy. One of the ways in which we can start looking into what's going on with second language speakers is to build up a collection of interactions. So I just want to focus on the openings of first conversations, which seem like a very straightforward thing to do. But as we'll see, it's not quite as straightforward as it might seem. So when we're opening a first conversation, so this is someone we don't know, the first thing you do is you've got to become co-present with the person. There's some kind of greeting exchange, introducing, exchanging names, self or other identifying, things like pleasantries, so nice to meet you and so on. And this is what we call the opening phase of the conversation. And then we have some kind of, very frequently, some kind of self-disclosure sequence. So what do you do, or where are you from, and so on, which is what we call the anchor position of these openings. So this is just an opening of a first conversation between two Americans, Dan, yes, he really is Dan Brown, and Charles. So I'll just play you the clip here.
Hi, I'm Dan Brown.
Dan, I'm Charles.
Charles, nice to meet you.
Me too.
Are you a student here?
I am not a student here.
Okay, what do you do?
Volunteer. I'm a software engineer. I work for a video game company.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So what's interesting about this opening is it's incredibly canonical. It's exactly how you might think a first conversation might open. So we have a hi, we have the introducing, I'm Dan, I'm Charles, nice to meet you, nice to meet you. And then they get straight into a first question, are you a student here? And then, as it turns out, he hasn't sort of guessed right and he's not actually a student. So we can see these sort of forms coming in recurrently. Although I said this is a canonical pattern, what's really interesting about the collection of data that I've got more than 100 of these collected up, it almost never happens exactly like this. So that's really interesting. I just want to play a clip between, this is one between an Australian, Danny, and Danielle and Hiro, a native Japanese speaker who are meeting for the first time. Unfortunately for me, the clip won't play in the PowerPoint because it's a move, it's kind of another file, but I'll just play the opening here for you. Okay, so here we see the same sorts of things going on. We get the greetings, hi. We also have a pleasantry coming in from Hiro. We get an introducing from Danielle. As you would have seen in the video, they had a lot of trouble negotiating. Are we going to bow or we're going to shake hands? And they went back and forth on that, and they finally landed on what they're doing. What's interesting here is this question from Danielle. What's your name? This is what we might say is an implicit orientation to an accountable bridge. So in these kind of openings of first conversations, when someone does an introducing of self, it's what the preferred response here is to say your name back. So to reciprocate the self-introducing. So my name is Danielle. What we don't seem to hear is Hiro saying what his name is. So Danielle follows up with what's your name? My name is Hiro. And then we get the anchor position. So you're Japanese as well. Sahowever, although that seems like what's going on, and I have to give a shout out to PhD student Yuji Sato, who helped with his transcription. What we notice when we look really closely at this is the initial greeting is not between Hiro and Danielle, but between Danielle and her friend Yui. So they're saying, hello, hi. And then Hiro comes in with, hi, I'm Hiro. But it's an overlap with Danielle saying hi to her friend Yui. And then Danielle comes in with hi. She turns to Hiro. She notices he's there and he comes in. So actually we've got, hi, I'm Hiro. Nice to meet you. What we don't have is Danielle reciprocating in turn. We just have a hi, we have a hi, hi. Then we have a my name is Danielle. So actually there's a kind of misalignment going on here, which is really interesting. So this trouble source of here, what's your name, actually goes all the way back to the self-introduction by Hiro in overlap. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that although on first glance it seems like Hiro is not introducing himself in a competent way because he's been asked to give his name, actually he did give his name, and the trouble source here is it was an overlap and perhaps Danielle didn't hear what he said. This is from the VMouth corpus. So this is a corpus of Skype first conversations, which was recorded. It's a researcher in one of the Danish universities, and they're focusing on English lingua franca. Here we get a really similar thing. There's greetings, nice to meet you, pleasantries. Then they actually go on to try to figure out what the topic is. And then what's interesting here, we have this introducing Mia, that's my name, I'm from Germany. And there's this kind of meta comment. So first of all, maybe I want to introduce myself. So what we have here is Mia's orientating to this preference for introducing self in this opening phase. So treating this as something which should have been done before. So the point I'm making here is that this L2 speaker, this English lingua franca speaker, is orientating to these underlying preference structures. Then what's interesting is this is a bit further in the conversation. They talk a bit about what Mia is studying. Then we have this, so are you from Finland or are you from another country? So if you go back, actually, I haven't got it's in the bit which I haven't shown you. Mia already knows that Olivia is from Finland. So asking, so you're from Finland or you're from another country is a redundant question because she already knows. So what's going on here? Actually, again, we get this kind of implicit orientation to an accountable breach, which is Olivia hasn't reciprocated her name. So we get this, no, I'm from Finland. Okay, yeah, so sorry. And then what's interesting here is we get this kind of gap and slight disfluency and laughter, which we could construe as awkward laughter. And then Olivia goes on, oh, hello, my name is Olivia. I'm 27, I'm from Finland. So again, we get this orientation to underlying norms of interaction of these openings, the first conversations by these L2 or lingua franca speakers. The other thing that I want to focus on here is just this particular practice of awkward laughter. So I call it awkward laughter because it's actually orientating to an interactional trouble, which is Mia's brought up, so you're from Finland, and Olivia's just responding, yeah, I am from Finland. So when she's not getting what she needs here, which is, are you going to introduce yourself? So what's interesting about awkward laughter is it's recurrently a practice for exiting some kind of interactional trouble. So although I've labeled it awkward laughter, so it's kind of indexing some kind of awkwardness, actually what it's doing is it's a method, it's a practice by which we exit interactional troubles in interaction. So I'll go on to show you what I mean by that. I'm looking at a kind of Corpus Pragmatics perspective. Okay, so Corpus Pragmatics is essentially a combination of corpus linguistics, which is looking at forms in corpora, and pragmatics, which is looking at functions in context. I know that's a bit of a generalization, but they come together, corpus pragmatics, looking at pragmatic functions in corpora. Now, one of the big challenges in corpus pragmatics is because it's drawing from corpus linguistics, the main way in which we try to get at these pragmatic functions is by looking for forms. Otherwise, the only other way of doing it is to annotate the data for particular pragmatic functions like speech acts, politeness, and so on. So how can we start getting at things here? So I talked about this awkward laughter thing. And I said that this is a recurrent practice. And what I mean by a recurrent practice is we see the same thing happening in other places to accomplish the same sort of thing here.
After that, I don't know, I don't really have
unfortunately, I won't play the clip there because it's a little bit hard to hear. So again, what I'm trying to get at is they're talking along, and then what we get is, yeah, yes, Then we get laughter, we get a kind of meta comment, awkward, yeah, I know, ha, ha. And then immediately after that, they restart onto the new sequence. So essentially, this kind of laughter following the sort of breakdown as disfluency, as we saw in the previous one as well, is a way of exiting this kind of breakdown and progressivity in the interaction. So then my question is, how can we find such things in corpora? Sort of looking through tens of millions of words of transcripts is really not feasible. So we really have a number of challenges for Corpus Pragmatics. So one of the things is assembling pragmatic phenomena. We really need large data sets to assemble robust collections of particular pragmatic functions. So pragmatic functions don't happen, if you're looking at a specific one, they're not happening in every particular conversation. So we need to collect up a lot of data to find enough examples of them. But spoken data is really expensive to collect. You have to record it, you have to transcribe it, and so on. So we have a kind of data bottleneck. The second thing is, how do we find these things? So you can't do a search for awkward laughter. I mean, it's a combination of different things. And probably the simplest way of saying it is there's no one-to-one relationship between pragmatic functions and linguistic forms. But of course, to annotate spoken data, to get in experts to say, this is a request, this is a so on, this is really expensive. So we have a kind of inferential bottleneck. The other thing we have, one of the other problems we have is when we analyze pragmatic phenomena, when we abstract away from the context of occurrence, we're actually undermining the integrity of the pragmatic phenomena because they're always really situated. But spoken data, of course, is accessed through transcription. So we have a kind of context bottleneck as well. So how might we start dealing with these challenges and start taking advantage of these larger data sets of spoken corpora that are being assembled? So one of the challenges we have is when we're assembling different spoken data collections, there's different formats, there's different transcription practices, and of course, different interests of the people compiling those spoken corpora. So one of the most obvious things to do, and I do hope people in corpus linguistics will start doing this more and more, is to link the transcripts with audio-visual recordings. TalkBank is a really great example of that because that gives the researcher access to the original data. Transcripts, of course, is a representation. It's not the data, it's a representation of it. The second thing we can start doing is creating interlingual ontologies, which allow us to crosswalk between different transcription practices. I'm just going to skip that bit about ontologies and go on to probably the main point I wanted to make about this awkward laughter thing is really what we're looking for to undertake Corpus Pragmatics is what I would call combinatorial search. So at the moment, the current approach or the most common approach to Corpus Pragmatics is to be studying linguistic forms in their discourse context. So kind of concordance-based queries, a complementary approach, so it's not to replace it, but to extend what we can do in Corpus Pragmatics, is to be studying combinations of linguistic and non-linguistic forms in their sequential contexts. And so this is a kind of combinatorial query that we're getting at. So just to compare, of course, I said you can't look for awkward laughter. You can look for the phrase awkward laughter, but that's not the same as the actual pragmatic phenomena. This is a metapragmatic label for it. So we can look for the metapragmatic label. We can do a metapragmatic, corpus-based metapragmatic study of awkward laughter, but we can't actually find the phenomena itself in this way. But there is a way of doing it. So if we start analyzing what it involves, going back to that previous one, we have some kind of silence, we have speaker change, and we have laughter. So if we start looking for a combination of silence, speaker change, and laughter, then this is one way to identify at least candidate examples of awkward laughter. So there's different ways of doing this. You can do a regular expression search across spoken corpora. Another way of doing it is kind of XQuery search, where you're searching CA transcribed corpora through Xtranscript. This is work by Chris Ruhlman and Matt G in Manchester. For the second one, a basic knowledge of programming is required. The first one, you need some kind of knowledge of regular expressions, and it's a little bit complicated. So one of the things we've been looking at is whether this can be done. We've tried it with a couple of 3 different corpora in the Australian National Corpus, which are transcribed in different ways, seeing if we can identify instances in this way using combinatorial searches, and we were able to do it. But as I said, one of the problems with that is either you need to know how to use regular expressions, or you need to know some basic programming to do XQuery searches. So is there an alternative? Well, we think there is. So one of the ways in which we can start doing these in recurrent ways is to start using tools which enable us to do reproducible combinatorial searches. So we can use R scripts in R notebooks or Jupyter notebooks. The advantage of these is they're reusable across different spoken corpora. So this is just a particular example of that going on. So essentially, I was just trying to give a bit of a shout out to some of the work that we're doing in our language technology and data analysis lab, or LADAL, where we're developing a computing lab in the school. There's already an online virtual lab, which I'll put that link in the chat later on, so you can click on it. We've also got another webinar series if you're interested in language and technology. And Martin Schreinberger is the director of LADAL. We're also working in a number of funded infrastructure projects. And this is a shout out for people in sort of working in L2 pragmatics, and not just L2 pragmatics, but applied linguistics more generally, to start trying to draw from these sorts of techniques to do the sort of work you want to be doing as well. Okay, so implications. I think I'm nearly on time here. So implications for Corpus Pragmatics. So I just wanted to draw together a few of the threads which I think are relevant. So you noticed when I was doing an analysis, I was diving in very deep into the sort of details of what exactly people were saying, how they were saying it, when exactly they were saying it. And the reason for this is because actually when people are speaking with each other, they do it in really fine-tuned and ordered ways. What underpins the kind of inference that goes on is a kind of abductive inference. This is essentially about why that now? Why is that person saying that now in that way? So abductive reasoning, when we're interacting with others, is rooted in these recurrent context-free procedures, methods, or practices. So this kind of laughter following speaker change, following a breakdown in progressivity and speaker change, laughter as a method to exit out of a troubled sequence and launch a new sequence, that's context-free. What I mean by context-free is it's not restricted to first conversations. It's something that can happen in all sorts of different activities and so on. Of course, these particular context-free methods or practices or procedures and so on, they're done in these sort of patterned ways, which makes them recognizable and accountable as implementing particular sets of meanings in situated contexts. So how is it that we can get at these context-free procedures or methods? A practice or a procedural method is a recurrent assemblage of particular features of the composition, both linguistic and non-linguistic, and the position within a term construction unit, a term, a sequence, and an overall interaction of an element of conduct. And this is the point I'm really trying to get at, that these meanings interaction are implemented through assemblages of practices. And these practices and their assemblages, the way in which we bring them together, constitute the systematics of language use. It's kind of like the grammar. And what's interesting is we've been learning about the systematics or grammar of language use over a number of decades. And I think we're getting to the point where we can start giving a kind of coherent account of the systematics of language use, which is analogous and in the same sort of level of detail as the grammar of a language itself. But still plenty of work to be done. So what are the implications for L2 pragmatics? So one of the things that that I'd advocate is the spoken corpora offer access to real life conversations in multiple different contexts, and they are suitable for different L2 classroom settings. You can start from very simple conversations to very complex ones. The point that I think would be really important to make is it's been shown repeatedly by people working in L2 Pragmatics that the ways in which conversations are represented in textbooks do not really reflect the ways in which people talk with each other. So if we're trying to teach people how to communicate, how we're trying to teach spoken communication, the best thing to do is to show people how actually people really communicate, not how people don't communicate. So another thing is that research in pragmatics can offer us insights into this underlying systematics or grammar of language use. And we really need to be thinking about this grammar or systematics of language use as just as important as learning the language itself. So I shouldn't say the language, but learning the kind of syntactic and lexical, semantic, and the kind of pronunciation aspects of language as well. So trying to break out of that kind of Chomskyan, competence versus performance idea where language use is being put into performance. In fact, it's just as systematic as a grammar of a language. It's just, it just takes a bit of effort to kind of unravel that systematic nature of language use. And finally, of course, I'm advocating Corpus Pragmatics, which is linking in with the focus of the series. I think it offers really interesting ways of bringing together an understanding of the systematics of language use together with real life examples of it, which again could be really useful in the classroom. So what I haven't done tonight, and that's why I said I overpromised here, what I haven't done is I haven't shown how you would actually do this in the classroom. And the reason that I didn't try to do that is because I understood that the audience here is really from a very diverse background. You'd be working with all sorts of different languages, not just English, and also all sorts of different types of language learning settings. So I didn't think I was going to be able to do justice to that at all. But I can point you, if you want to contact me later, to some of the work that's been done in L2 Pragmatics by people like Carsten Rover at Melbourne Uni, Gabby Casper up in Hawaii, Hansun Waring and Jean Wong across in the Northeast in New York, all working on ways in which we can draw in this kind of real life analysis of real life language use into our classroom. So I can certainly point you to the really interesting work. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you so much, Michael. A really fascinating talk. We're going to open it up now for questions. So at this point, I will stop the recording. But just before I do that, I'm just going to show who our next presenter is next week, next Thursday, again at the same time. We have System Professor Agnieszka Lenko-Szymanska from the University of Warsaw, who's going to be presenting on Corpora in second language vocabulary assessment, and she's just turned the video camera on there, so say hello there. Great to see you, and
I'd like to invite you all.
Having you next week. Oh, wonderful! All right, we're all invited. So at this point, then I will stop the recording and we'll open it up for questions.